Previously on The Legend of IBB.
Cancel.
It's not competent.
Cancel. Yes.
IBB is not competent.
He must go.
The Babangida regime faced unprecedented political and social unrest, religious violence, and presided over an era of extreme economic hardship. Yet, it managed to survive one crisis after another and remain in power for 8 years. No Nigerian leader fastened his hands as tightly to power as Babangida did, and no challenge he faced could loosen his grip. How did Babangida manage to confront every challenge, threat and crisis and emerge intact? Strategy 1. Retirements, dismissals and rotations. Prior to Babangida, Nigerian military regimes were exercises in collective governance by the officers in the military ruling council. Babangida's rise to power marks the end of the collective-style military regimes and the beginning of an autocratic, personalized dictatorship. Strategy 2. The Retired Millionaires Generals Club. An overlooked feature of the Babangida regime is its deployment of a cadre of retired military officers to political positions. There were plenty of political candidates for these positions, as Babangida's continual retirement of officers created a class of wealthy young retired officers. They became a potent economic and political force and an ultra-elite within the upper class. Although the retired men had their access to weapons, troops and ammunition severed, they possessed wealth and contacts that could turn them into dangerous elements if slighted. To prevent such retired wealthy and powerful men from becoming future sources of opposition to him, Babangida retired them from army service but mollified them by giving them ministerial positions in the FMG. Unusual examples of this patronage were Babangida's retrospective promotions of his deputy, Augustus Aikomo and Domkat Bali, to 4-star generals after their retirements. Aikomo was retired from the Navy but retained his position as Babangida's deputy, albeit with a new job title of vice president. Babangida also retired Major Generals Nwachukwu, Kure, Nasco and Kontagora from the military, but kept them in the FMG as civilians. The practice of retiring officers from the military but retaining them in the FMG was a new phenomenon in Nigerian politics. Alongside his former military regime, Babangida was creating an unelected dictatorship involving retired military officers. Babangida's regime could thus be seen as a hybrid military regime of serving and retired military officers, and different from prior military governments whose rule was derived from military membership and authority. Membership in Babangida's junta derived from his personal prerogative, not from membership of the military. When ministerial vacancies were saturated and could not be filled by retired officers, Babangida often found non-ministerial political or administrative roles for them in the quasi-official bodies he constantly created. Babangida made retired officers extremely wealthy and satisfied in retirement by creating boards, commissions, and administrative bodies to which they would be appointed. For example, after retiring the heads of the Air Force, Navy, and Police in December 1989, he created new roles to keep the retired men employed. The former Inspector General of Police, Mohammed Gambo, was appointed to the newly created post of National Security Advisor and later became the head of MAMSA. The retired Chief of Air Staff, Air Vice Marshal Alpha, was also appointed to a newly created position of Coordinator of the Political Transition Program, and the retired Chief of Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Koshoni, was appointed Chairman of the National Internal Security Reorganization Committee. There were many other examples of the appointment of retired officers to quasi-governmental bodies. The use of quasi-official bodies became so prevalent that Babangida would create an official government-appointed committee with an alphabet soup of acronyms to investigate any controversy and submit an official report, no matter how distant from official FMG policy. Each such committee was an opportunity to place more people on the gravy train and expand the patronage network. The trivialization of committees is demonstrated by the FMG's appointment of a committee to review Nigeria's ban from international youth football tournaments after FIFA discovered that Nigeria had cheated by fielding overage players in the 1989 Under-17 World Cup. Diplomatic positions were also another way of keeping retired officers occupied. Senior officers who could not be accommodated in the government were often sent abroad to serve as ambassadors, thereby maintaining them in prestigious positions while simultaneously keeping the ambitious among them too far away to become sources of instability or revolt. Retired officers also benefited when it came to awarding government contracts. In July 1986, Major General Abacha circulated a written notice to several government ministries asking them to consider retired military officers when awarding government contracts. Strategy 3: Settlements. After leaving office, political leaders are typically vilified for their actions while in government. Negative appraisals and biographies of their stewardships are usually written by their former government colleagues. George W. Bush and Tony Blair are recent examples of that process. Although he headed a government which brought great turmoil in Nigeria and caused its worst political crisis for 3 decades, hardly anyone who worked for or with Babangida has anything bad to say about him. Even those whom he sacked, retired or offended, refused to publicly speak ill of him. Why is a man whose government caused such controversy still personally liked by so many? Babangida's generosity is legendary. He won considerable support via his tremendously skillful use of money as a means to circumvent opposition. Rather than confront or engage his opponents in direct battle, Babangida would simply buy their silence or compliance by giving them money. This practice became known as settlement. It was not just opponents and critics who were settled. Serving officers were kept mollified and sedated by generous extra budgetary financial disbursements and lavish gifts. This created a symbiotic relationship whereby officers came to expect money and gifts in exchange for continuing to provide loyalty and security for Babangida. An officer close to Babangida later confessed that Babangida operated one of the most generous welfare programs the military ever had. In 1991, Babangida authorized the allocation of 500 million naira for the purchase of new cars for junior officers, mostly majors and captains, and equivalent ranks in the Air Force. That year, nearly 2% of the FMG's budget was spent on purchasing cars for military officers. The car scheme was nicknamed IBB Spirits. NCOs were reported to have been given motorbikes and bicycles. Many officers who were recipients of the car scheme subsequently perished in the Ejigbo plane crash on September 26, 1992. Settlement was sometimes preemptive and could occur months or years in advance. Babangida's charming of the military could take the form of presents and donations to commemorate officers and their families' weddings, births, deaths, or traditional festivals such as Christmas and Eid. A soldier who served in Babangida's brigade of guards told me that on Salah, Babangida gave every soldier in the brigade gifts including yards of brocade and goats. When critics could not be financially settled, he invited them to join the government. This gave him a first tier of military support and a second tier of civilian support consisting of respected public figures who by their support of Babangida's regime disarmed any possible future criticism of him. One such masterstroke was his startling appointment of the renowned military government critic and socialist Tai Solarin. Solarin had been detained for 17 months by the previous regime of Buhari for his stringent criticism of its policies. In November 1989, Solarin accepted Babangida's offer to head the newly formed People's Bank, a credit program to provide microfinancing to small entrepreneurs. Even Solarin was taken aback by Babangida's offer and admitted that it was a little queer, a little irregular. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry when the president offered me the job. Babangida also managed to convince another strident government critic, Nobel laureate Professor Wole Soyinka, to serve as the chairman of the Federal Road Safety Commission (FRSC). As well as courting military and civilian support, Babangida also moved to ensure he had the loyalty of traditional rulers. When the 85-year-old Sultan of Sokoto, Abubakar Siddiq III, died on November 1, 1989, after more than half a century on the throne, Babangida directly interfered with the choice of the 11 clerics who normally select the Sultan. He ensured that his associate Ibrahim Dasuki was appointed to succeed Siddiq, ahead of Siddiq's eldest son, Muhammadu Machidu. The urbane, wealthy Dasuki was a stark contrast to the austere and aged Siddiq. Dasuki was an Oxford University-trained investment banker and was also a close family friend, business associate, and literal godfather to Babangida. He was also the chairman of and a major shareholder in the Bank of Credit and Commerce International Nigeria. Dasuki's son Sambo was an army officer and was also close to Babangida. Sambo participated in the 1983 and 1985 coups that brought Buhari and Babangida respectively to power. When news of Ibrahim Dasuki's appointment spread, angry mobs chanting "We don't want" in Hausa took to the streets, burned down a radio station, besieged Dasuki's house and set BCCI, Nigeria Sokoto's premise, on fire in protest at his appointment. Several people were killed in the unrest. The protesters correctly suspected that Dasuki's appointment as Sultan was a result of political machinations and that he was not the true choice of the cleric kingmakers. Settlements greatly diversified the elite class. It introduced a second generation of brash and cosmopolitan, nouveau rich with new money and little of the first generation elite's restraints. Nonetheless, the twin tactics of settlements and the retired millionaire generals club created a new elite that traversed the military, political, business, academic, and traditional ruler sectors. It seemed everyone was in Babangida's pockets. The matrix of multiple layered patronage relationships between them provided Babangida with a buffer of civilian and military support, forming a protective ring of loyalty to him. Those who had been settled existed in an umbilical relationship with the federal government, feeding off the state. The state and its resources, as controlled by Babangida, provided opportunity, money, and jobs to them in exchange for their loyalty and support. Strategy 4: Security and Paranoia. However, there were some people who could not be settled. To deal with such people and threats to his power, Babangida employed less settled measures. Perhaps understandably, in a coup-prone country, Babangida's regime was the most security-conscious government in Nigerian history. Security around Babangida was extremely tight. Even senior generals were required to surrender not just their personal weapons, but also their swagger sticks before being ushered into his presence. Babangida himself was security conscious to the point of paranoia, and he was surrounded by men of like minds. His first chief of army staff was the ultra-security conscious Sani Abacha, a man who had a consuming phobia for security. Abacha was the enforcer and the protector of the Babangida regime, and was much appreciated by Babangida because Abacha, by long practice, read coup indicators very well. Babangida also maintained a tight grip on the intelligence services. The NSO was the first autonomous national intelligence agency in Nigeria. It was created in 1976 by the Obasanjo regime after the February 1976 coup in which General Murtala Mohammed was assassinated. The intelligence failure to detect and prevent the coup motivated the NSO's creation. Prior to the NSO's creation, intelligence gathering had largely been the responsibility of the Police Special Branch, also known as the E Branch, which was created in 1958. The Special Branch was later absorbed into the NSO, which became a feared instrument of the Buhari regime. Babangida dissolved Buhari's dreaded NSO in a move that was initially interpreted as paving the way for a more benevolent intelligence apparatus. He sacked the NSO's Director General, Alhaji Lawal Rafinadi, and placed him in detention for 40 months. In place of the NSO, Babangida created 3 new security agencies on June 5, 1986. These new agencies were autonomous from the military and reported directly to him. They were the National Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the State Security Service. The National Intelligence Agency, NIA, which was responsible for gathering overseas intelligence and the detection, reporting, and evaluation of external threats to Nigeria, first headed by Chief Albert Hosful. The Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, which is responsible for intramilitary intelligence, first headed by Babatunde Elegbede. The DIA had been in existence since 1984 as a coordinating body, but had its existence formally characterized by military decree under the Babangida regime. The State Security Service, SSS, which is responsible for domestic intelligence and subsequently proved to be the most feared and brutal of the intelligence organizations. It was first headed by Ismaila Gwarzo. In addition to these agencies was the shadowy Directorate of Military Intelligence, DMI, under Colonel Haliru Akilu. Wole Soyinka once described Akilu as the virtual power behind Nigeria's security services. Akilu had well-honed martial credentials. During the Metasini religious riots of the early 1980s, Akilu, then a major, was the commanding officer of the 146th Infantry Battalion. His troops and soldiers from the 202nd Armored Battalion helped in the bloody suppression of the riots. The DMI under Akilu's leadership watched the military form within and became the country's unofficial coup prevention service. The DMI was thoroughly efficient at sniffing out telltale signs of subversion and coup plotting. Such signs might include officers traveling outside their duty posts without authorization, increases in requests for ammunition or unscheduled training or live firing exercises. As consequences of the DMI's watchful eye was that officers became paranoid and were apprehensive of making even legitimate troop movements for fear of being falsely accused of coup plotting. Although ostensibly serving different purposes, the intelligence agencies often overlapped. Their shared reason the terror was, after all, the survival of Babangida's regime. In time, they became even more brutal and repressive than the NSO they replaced. Above the intelligence agencies, Babangida created the new office of the Coordinator of National Security. The Coordinator of National Security, Brigadier Aliu Mohammed, advised and reported directly to Babangida on the activities of the intelligence agencies. He also chaired the Joint Intelligence Board, which collected, analyzed, and coordinated reports from all the intelligence agencies. Although the Joint Intelligence Board was procedurally supposed to report to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in practice, its deliberations often reported directly to Babangida, who was the main beneficiary of its work. Mohammed is regarded as the architect of Nigeria's modern intelligence network and is frequently referred to in the Nigerian press as Aliu Mohammed Gusau. Gusau is Mohammed's hometown, and the town's name was appended to his name as a way of distinguishing him from Alhaji Aliu Mohammed, a civilian who served in the Babangida government at the same time. Brigadier Aliu Mohammed graduated from the NDA's Pioneer First Regular Combatant course in 1967, where he was in the same intake as other cadets who later became prominent, such as Oladipo Dia, Joshua Dogoyaro, Salihu Ibrahim, Ishola Williams, Alison Maduike, Bello Kaliel, and Maman Kontagora. He was also close to powerful political and military figures such as Major General Shehu Musa Yaradua. He was sufficiently trusted by Yaradua that prior to General Gowon's overthrow in 1975, Yaradua, leader of the plot against Gowon, revealed details of the plot to him. He later became the Director of Military Intelligence, then Director General of the Defense Intelligence Agency during the Buhari regime. Mohammed was retired by Buhari in 1985 over a racketeering scandal, where his experience and knowledge of the skeletons in the cupboard was sufficient for Babangida to squash his retirement and reinstate him into the army in an elevated position. He joined the army as the new head of the NSO and oversaw its deconstruction. When the post was abolished in December 1989, he was reposted into the army as the GOC of the 2nd Mechanized Division in Ibadan, but in January 1993, returned to an intelligence posting as the National Security Advisor. For protection, Babangida deployed a number of officers personally close to him in concentric circles. In these circles were his trusted aides from the Bida Middle School, now Government College Bida, course-mates, subordinates from his days as commander of the Army's Armored Corps, and the cabal of officers who had executed the coup which got him into power. Key security and command postings were always controlled by a small coterie of ultra-Babangida loyalists. Command of key army formations such as intelligence, artillery, signals, and the Armored Corps were always in the hands of these men. As a former member of the Armored Corps, Babangida understood that the Corps was pivotal to the success of military coup. He never let anyone other than his trusted acolytes command the Armored Corps. At times, the government resembled an old boys network of personal friends and classmates. A senior military officer in the government, Garba Duba, was a cousin of Babangida's wife, Miriam, and was also Babangida's school classmate from the Bida Middle School. Babangida also later brought his other classmates from the Bida Middle School, such as Abdusalam Abubakar, Maman Vatsa, Gadonasko, and Sani Sami, into the FMG. Babangida justified his deployment of his network of old friends into the FMG on the basis that it would be immoral for him not to reward the loyalty of friends by giving them government posts. The coup plotting fraternity. The power of Babangida's regime members was not always determined by their rank, seniority, length of service, or the position they held. Rather, it was determined by how close they were to Babangida and how crucial they were in bringing him to power and keeping him there. Bonds of loyalty and common purpose were often formed in the blood and fire of coup plots. The need for absolute trust and secrecy in the execution and suppression of coups firmly welded these bonds. Shagaya and Dogonyaru helped Babangida in suppressing the failed 1976 Dimka coup. The civil war in which many officers in the regime had fought together was another unifying factor. Operating as a clique and nerve center at the core of the government was a group of approximately 24 officers who staged the coup that brought Babangida to power in 1985. Members of this group referred to themselves as the caucus, but they were known by the Nigerian press and public as the IBB boys. They straddled senior and middle ranks of the military. The most senior of them was Sani Abacha, followed in order by seniority by Joshua Dogonyaru, David Mark, and John Shagaya. Many caucus members were mid and junior ranking officers trained by Babangida during his time as an instructor at the NDA and/or who had served under him when he commanded the Armor Corps. Officers in these categories included Abubakar Umar, Mohammed Marwa, Tunde Ogbeha, Lawan Gwadabe, Joshua Madaki, Chris Garuba, John Mark Inyenge, and Esiet Nkanga. Other prominent members included Aliu Mohammed, Raji Razaki, Haliru Akilu, Sambu Dasuki, Abdul Mumuni Aminu, John Madaki, Tanko Ayuba, and Ahmed Abdullahi. The caucus was Babangida's kitchen cabinet, and its members were fanatically loyal to him. Major Abubakar Umar later said he had so much faith in Babangida that he was willing to follow him into battle blindfolded if need be. The only outsiders or non-caucus members to ever hold significant military postings or power in Babangida's regime were Lieutenant Generals Domkat Bali and Salihu Ibrahim. These exceptions owe their position to respect for their experience and professionalism. Even though some caucus members were not officially in the FMG, they were more powerful than senior officers and the AFRC members. They would also often make decisions about the postings, career progression, and retirement of their own superiors. This is not to say that caucus members were never members of titular bodies. Many of them served in the AFRC as military governors or in the National Council of Ministers. The membership and existence of this caucus was not official, and it could not be found in the text of the Constitution or any decree. It operated as a shadowy cartel within the government, and its members' de facto power and influence were guaranteed irrespective of whether they served on de jure positions in the FMG or AFRC. Before major AFRC deliberations, the caucus would discuss and rehearse positions on matters to be discussed to ensure they got their own way. Power lay with them and not in titular bodies such as the AFRC and the National Council of Ministers. The decisions of such de jure bodies were often made in advance at a caucus meeting, with Babangida then entering the official meeting and going through the motions of a genuine debate before getting these bodies to rubber stamp the decisions. With his loyalties so strategically placed and his astute spreading of wealth officers in or close to the government, two things were ensured. Firstly, Babangida could be removed only by a coup executed by soldiers outside his regime. Secondly, any attempt to remove Babangida would lead to bloodshed. The huge patronage network amongst officers meant that most officers in key positions were fiercely loyal to Babangida, or at least viewed him as the lesser of known evils. They would not support a coup that carried the risk of diluting their status and access to patronage. The loyalty of Babangida's key unit commanders ensured that they would fiercely resist any coup attempt, and that the coup plotter had to be determined and ruthless enough to eliminate not just Babangida, but his massive following of loyal officers. Only an extraordinary violent coup by regime outsiders could realistically depose Babangida. That is precisely what was attempted on April 22, 1990.